Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our 5th Advanced Program webinar of the year. My name is Katie Briggs, and I'm your webinar host. This webinar is part 5 of a 7-part series taking place this year. Our series highlights topics you've shared with us and is tied directly to our 5th anniversary's mission to continue empowering public media. We're grateful for our series lead sponsor, CARS. So during today's session, we will allow for audience questions. Please be sure to use the Q&A function within the webinar platform to ask a question to our panelists, and we'll do our best to get to everybody's questions. Now for the main event. Today we are celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment with the creator and executive producer of Unladylike, Charlotte Mangin and Sandra Rattley. Unladylike2020 is an innovative multimedia series featuring diverse and little-known American heroines from the early years of feminism and the women who now follow in their footsteps, timed to honor the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. I'm thrilled today to present today's moderator, Liz Adiola. Liz Adiola is an Emmy award-winning journalist at PBS Utah. Liz is a host and producer for This Is Utah and is the host and executive producer of Utah Insight. Liz, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. And I am so excited about this celebration and this opportunity that public women in leadership has to introduce these incredible women who are innovators and have done so much to bring us this content and these stories of women who haven't gotten their due in history. And so with that, I would like to introduce Charlotte Mangin, who is an award-winning documentary filmmaker and creator and producer and director of Unladylike2020. She spent 5 years on the production staff of National Geographic Television and Film, reporting from the jungles of the Amazon to the Himalayan mountains, and 5 years as a story producer for PBS's award-winning series, Wide Angle. She recently served as the interim executive director of Futuro Media Group. And along with her, we also have Sandra Rattley. Sandra has been executive producer of the seminal documentary projects like Unladylike2020, as well as the Peabody Award-winning series, Wade in the Water, on African-American sacred music produced with the Smithsonian Institute, and Making the Music, hosted by Wynton Marsalis. She was also executive producer of the PBS Digital Studios series, Read Awakening, and executive producer for TV and video at Futuro Media, where she launched the PBS series, America by the Numbers and Humanizing America, a series of digital shorts distributed by NBC.com. She is the former VP for Cultural Programming at NPR, where she launched the weekly show, one of my favorites, Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, as well as NPR's Office of Community Engagement. Ladies, welcome. Thank you for being forgiving for my stumble there at the beginning, but I am so excited to jump into this conversation with you about Unladylike 2020. Welcome today.
Thank you for having us.
Let's start with you, Charlotte, about how the idea came about to create this series of stories. There was something that kind of struck a nerve with you when you were talking with your son. Can you share a little bit about that?
Sure. So I have 2 little boys, and I brought them one day to the Intrepid Museum, which is an aircraft carrier in New York that's been transformed into an air and space museum. And we learned of a pilot named Eleanor Smith, who in the 1920s got her license at age 16, the youngest pilot in the world. And the men at her airfield didn't believe that a girl could fly. And so they dared her to fly under a bridge. You may know this was the time when barnstorming, all these crazy aerial stunts, was all the rage. So Eleanor Smith flew under all 4 bridges of the East River in New York City to really prove herself to them. She even had to go sort of sideways in between oncoming boat traffic under the Brooklyn Bridge, and went on to become this extraordinary test pilot, broke a number of endurance records, and late in her career actually worked with NASA on flight simulators. And I was just blown away by her story and really frustrated. Why have I never heard of Eleanor Smith? So I started to research her, And that led me to other women in aviation and women in other professional fields. And it just grew and grew into this treasure trove. I must have researched over 250 different women. And when I realized that the centennial of suffrage was coming up, I thought that was the perfect time peg for taking a look at where we've come in the past 100+ years and what remains to be done to reach gender equity.
And Sandy, this wasn't your first dive into a project like this. You had worked with Charlotte before on a similar project. Is that correct?
Charlotte and I started working together in 2012. So we've worked together for 8 years. And there is a PBS, an 8-part PBS series we worked on before that I was the executive producer and she was the line producer of. And that is America by the Numbers, looking at demographic change in the United States. So we'd already established, I should say, a complete ease of communication and working together and collaborating. So I was so excited when she came to me and asked me if I would executive produce this series and this project with her. And it's just been an extraordinary honor.
They are definitely incredible stories of women who've overcome sexism, racism. They've overcome so much only to be missing from history books, missing from the education in schools. What are you hoping people will get out of these stories now that they've gotten a peek of looking at these women's lives and knowing a little bit more about who they are? What do you hope will be the long-term effect of this project? Charlotte?
So today is the actual 100th anniversary of the date that the 19th Amendment was ratified. And it's exciting to see that in the mainstream media, there's finally a more nuanced discussion happening. But back when I started the project several years ago, the narrative of women of color changing America 100+ years ago was not at all mainstream. And we chose our women really with an eye toward both diversity of not only the professions they chose, but their racial ethnic background, their socioeconomic background, the geographies from which they came, but also whether or not they were known to the general public. And so we went out of our way to not choose the Susan B. Anthonys and the Amelia Earharts that everybody learns about in school. And research shows that only 1 in 15 historical figures in textbooks that are used in middle and high school history courses across the country feature women. Only 1 in 15 characters in the textbooks are women, and they're often mentioned as a sidebar. And so we really want the story of how women shaped this country and continue to, obviously, to be front and center and inspire new role models.
Did that make it difficult at all for the project to be picked up, that you weren't sticking with the Susan B. Anthonys and that you were going for more unknown women of history?
Yes, well, certainly in some, go ahead, Sandy.
In some ways, I think the challenge wasn't so much in selling the other women. It was in some ways telling their stories because of the fact that they were often, at the time that they were doing the amazing things they did, their accomplishments were not necessarily well documented. So we were very challenged oftentimes in finding archival material and finding the documentation of what they did. In many instances, we were very lucky because many of them may have had biographers or historians that focused on their lives. But the thing that we found was really the very fact of saying that people needed to get beyond those white East Coast suffragists and to look at the fact that history is built on many people's shoulders. The accomplishments of today just didn't happen miraculously. There's a long lineage of women that contributed to that. So we felt as if we were doing something very important relative to the telling of the story of this country, and also, as Charlotte mentioned, trying to reshape the way that the history is taught by documenting the fact that there are so many women who've contributed to the realization and experience of democracy as we know it today.
And probably more than 26 that were, you know, featured this year. I'm hoping that the series goes on for another year, because I'm just wondering, how did you narrow it down and say, okay, these are the women that we're going to feature this time around? And were there any that were left out that you really, really wanted to be a part of this first run?
Thank you for
Yeah.
that endorsement. We'd like that in writing. Go ahead, Charlotte.
Yes, so many stories have been left out and are waiting to be told, and we would love nothing more than a season 2. But we chose these 26 women, as I said, with this eye toward diversity in all these different areas, but also because our partners at PBS, American Masters, wanted this celebration to last as much of the year as possible. So it was 26, one per week, for the 26 weeks between the start of March, Women's History Month, and August 26th, next week, our final episode, which you'll get to preview soon. We culminate with the date that the 19th Amendment was actually entered into the Constitution and became law. So that's how we came up with 26. It was very ambitious to make a film a week, but somehow we've done it. And in addition to the films, we have this beautiful interactive website. PBS Learning Media is creating curriculum and lesson plans for middle and high school students across the country. We're hosting events, and events such as this one today, to spread the word in community. Yeah, hope to have an impact lasting long beyond the centennial of suffrage.
And also, Liz, I just want to add that because we got support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, as well as 10 state humanities councils from around the country, we had a panel of 8 scholars who basically sat in retreat with us for about 2 days. And we looked at this list of 250 women that was kind of the core that we started with, and looked at a number of factors in terms of the dramatic arc of their lives, whether in fact there was archival material, the extent to which their stories were known and documented, et cetera, to really pare down the list. So they got us down about as far as they could go, and then Charlotte and I took it from there, again, looking at the different factors in terms of geographic diversity, professional diversity, as well as ethnicity, gender, choices, et cetera, to come up with the 26.
And it is an incredible 26. And I am hoping for a second season of this, because we really, really are hungry for it. One of the things I also noticed in these pieces is that there is a heavy influence in music throughout the pieces. How did the decision to merge all of that into these documentary shorts happen?
Well, we really wanted to make the history feel hip and exciting to a 21st century audience. So musically, we decided to steer away from period music and really use contemporary music. We at one point even considered working with female DJs to remix period music into more hip hop, but that proved to be too complicated for us to tackle, because we were already remixing archive, as it were, you're about to see. But we worked with an artist who animates a number of scenes from our women's lives for which we were unable to find archival imagery, and also brings the black and white photography to life in color, again, wanting it to feel like the history is really present. And that's also why we chose to include the story of a woman in the same profession who's essentially walking in the footsteps of this woman from the past, and able to tell us about how, what the status of women in that field is today.
All right, I'm going to ask one more question before we get to our first clip. It's about the name Unladylike. We've heard a lot of terms being thrown about, nasty woman, terms where it's trying to get women to stop speaking out, stop standing, in what they believe in. Why was Unladylike chosen as the name of this project? And can you talk a little bit about how, in modern times, it seems like women are taking these terms, these phrases, and using them as a form of empowerment instead of a form of, or how they've been used in the past to silence women?
Sandy, do you want to take this one?
Well, it's really interesting that, there are many things that have been said. Laurel Ulrich in 1976 said, well-behaved women seldom make history. And we actually took the term unladylike from a journalist who, at the turn of the century, basically said, I don't want to be described as a lady. And I think all of these terms, in terms of bossy, nasty, even within the African American community, there's a trope that came from a very old TV show, Amos and Andy, in which there was a character called Sapphire, and that's also kind of been a derivative that that's given to Black women in terms of again being bossy. And I really think that we're at a point where, and part of what the series is helping us do is really look at the role of women in history, and to not allow the role of women and the accomplishments of women to be minimized. People talk about the fact that sometimes in certain spaces, women unnecessarily reduce themselves and make themselves small. So one of the things we're looking at is how women actually defied the stereotype of domesticity, because we're looking at a period of 1890 to 1920 when women were seen and expected to operate only as wives and mothers. And so the women that we're looking at really defied that limitation to excel, not only in the pursuit of education, but in the pursuit of careers, and not just in the pursuit of careers, but oftentimes being the first in their fields and really accomplishing great things. So we think that these women actually help to deconstruct those limitations, both the limiting terms, the limiting definitions, and the limiting expectations that are put on women. Because if these women could accomplish this over 100 years ago, we have nothing to stop us.
That's right. I got snaps for that. That is all right. We're going to get into this first clip now. Charlotte, if you can help set this up for what we're going to experience right now.
Absolutely. So the first film we're going to watch is about Mary Church Terrell, who was born actually the year of the Emancipation Proclamation being signed. She was the daughter of former slaves and went on to become one of the most prominent Black suffragists in the country, as well as involved in anti-lynching campaigns and civil rights activism more broadly. She was actually the first Black woman to be elected on a school board in the country, and worked into her 80s to help desegregate public spaces and schools in Washington, D.C. She's really extraordinary. So enjoy.
Mary Church Terrell is central to all of the major movements of the late 19th and early 20th century. Suffrage, anti-lynching, and desegregation.
1892, Memphis, Tennessee. 28-year-old Mary Church Terrell learned that her childhood friend had been killed by a lynch mob because his business was seen as competition by local whites.
The lynching of Thomas Moss is this turning point for Mary Church Terrell. His death is not just a symbol of racial violence, but also the ways that Black business owners were not shielded from the terrorizing of African Americans. So this fundamentally radicalizes her and how she's thinking about racial justice. And she's going to enter into the world of public activism.
Church Terrell and her journalist friend Ida B. Wells were among the first to speak out publicly against the thousands of lynchings that occurred at the turn of the century.
Hanging, shooting, and burning Black men, women, and children in the United States have become so common that such occurrences create little sensation. Tom Moss was murdered because he was succeeding too well. He was guilty of no crime but that.
Mary Church Terrell was born in Memphis, Tennessee in 1863. Her parents, both former slaves, were mixed race.
Mary Church Terrell comes from a very privileged and affluent background. Her father had made considerable money doing real estate and becomes one of, if not the first, African-American millionaire in the South. Also because this family is fair-skinned, they are able to have access to certain spaces that most peoples of African descent would not have had.
Church Terrell was one of the first African-American women to earn both a bachelor's and a master's degree when she graduated in 1888 from Oberlin College.
She's someone who's deeply invested in education, and teaching was the most common career pathway for African-American women and women more broadly who have completed college education. And so she takes her amazing talents to this new historically Black college, Wilberforce University, and teaches Latin there.
After studying in Europe for 2 years, Church Terrell moved to Washington, D.C. in 1890, where she taught at one of the first public high schools for African Americans. She soon married the chair of the language department, Harvard-educated Robert Terrell.
I enjoyed assisting him in the Latin department so much, I made up my mind to assist him in all departments for the rest of my natural life.
At first, she thinks about removing herself from public life because she's gotten married, which was an expectation for a lot of women. So for her to really galvanize around the pressing issues of the day and become a force in the founding of numerous organizations and campaigns that would ultimately reshape American history is quite phenomenal.
In 1892, Church Terrell and scholar Anna J. Cooper co-founded the Colored Women's League to address social problems facing the Black community.
It becomes a platform for her to think about the future of the race, one that's anchored in and created by and for Black women.
I am walking a path that Mary Church Terrell created. I would not be if it were not for her. This idea of combining the revolution of the classroom and the revolution of the streets had not really been done before her.
I am Brittany Packnett. I'm an activist, an educator, and a writer, and obsessed with justice. It's impossible for me to care about education and not also care about housing. It's impossible for me to care about housing and not also care about employment and a living wage. It's impossible for me to care about a living wage and not care about someone's health care. Police violence, racial justice, gender justice, all of these things are deeply interconnected. The truth of the matter is, I am committed to the belief that everyone can thrive.
In 1895, Church Terrell became one of the first African-American women appointed to a school board in the country. Serving over a decade, she advocated for equal access to education in Washington, D.C.
More than once, my heart was saddened when some pupil would say, "Education will do us no good." There is nothing for colored people to do except hold menial positions, and we don't need an education for that.
2 months after the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision upheld racial segregation in 1896, Church Terrell co-founded the National Association of Colored Women. Bringing together Black women's clubs from around the country, it advocated for reforms to improve African American life, including an end to segregation. She became its first president, coining the motto, "Lifting as we climb."
Lifting as we climb refers to continuing to climb out of the stereotypes about African Americans and specifically African American women that proliferated during this era, and lifting those communities most deeply affected by Jim Crow. This idea that these women who were educated and powerful could be the ones to really uplift those who did not have those resources.
The work we hope to accomplish can be done better, we believe, by the mothers, wives, daughters, and sisters of our race.
Mary Church Terrell saw voting rights as critical to the empowerment of African Americans. She sought support from white suffragists like Susan B. Anthony, whom she had met in the 1880s during her travels in Europe. She also picketed the White House with the white-led National Women's Party.
My sisters of the dominant race stand up, not only for the oppressed sex, but also for the oppressed race.
But her attempts to forge solidarity across racial lines were rebuffed. During one of the largest women's suffrage marches in 1913, like other black suffragists, Church Terrell was forced to walk in the segregated section at the back.
Mary Church Terrell is there, marching with these young women from Howard University and being a part of this very historical moment, because it's only a few years after this march that 19th Amendment is ratified. But she knows that Black women still don't have the status that white women do. So her activism around racial justice really intensifies.
Colored women are the only group in this country who have two heavy handicaps to overcome, that of race as well as that of sex.
As a founding member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, Church Terrell traveled the country to speak out for civil rights. She never stopped her protests against lynching, helping to organize the 1922 Silent March to pressure Congress to pass anti-lynching legislation.
Not a band played, not a sound was heard. As I walked in silence up Pennsylvania Avenue, I thought of Tom Moss, who had been brutally lynched, and I said to myself, there is at least one person in this protest who understands personally exactly what it means.
No one is born woke. There's something wakes you up. And so for Mary Church Terrell, it was her friend being lynched. For an entire generation, it was seeing the photo of the open casket of Emmett Till. And one of my catalysts in life would be the death and the legacy of Michael Brown Jr. So there are certainly catalytic events that continue to wake people up, continue to energize people around justice. When I joined the Ferguson Commission and then later President Obama's policing task force, it was to help try and be a bridge. Because my responsibility is to make sure that my community is heard in the very places where decisions about our future are being made. And that idea of lifting as we climb is so powerful. It's to say there is no success if our people don't come along with us.
Church Terrell led sit-ins and protests well into her 80s. After being denied entry 3 times at a popular downtown restaurant, she filed a lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court. A year before her death in 1954, the court ruled to desegregate restaurants and stores in the nation's capital. As many as 200 anti-lynching laws have been introduced in Congress since 1900. The latest one, named for Emmett Till, is still being debated in 2020.
She was someone who had a vision of justice that was always concerned about the unique position of Black women within the framework of American democracy.
She recognizes the innate and immense power of Black women.
I cannot help wondering what I might have become and might have done if I had lived in a country which had not circumscribed and handicapped me on account of my race, but had allowed me to reach any heights I was able to attain.
They say I don't act right, it's unladylike, how I wanna live my life.
All right, and we are back with a few more questions, and I hope you as the audience are also crafting your questions and also sharing them in the chat section so that we can have those questions ready at the end of the program to share with our panelists. But what an incredible piece about Mary Church Terrell. And you know, what I really noticed was that there's this craft of weaving in the hope and also the struggle of what she went through with what's happening today. Charlotte, can you talk a little bit about what went into doing that and making sure that that it was kind of on an even keel of not just leaving people feeling like they were, you know, banged over the head with this woman spent her entire life fighting for civil rights and justice, and we're still fighting for that today.
Indeed. We actually, at the very last minute, as you know, in the wake of George Floyd's death, and as the country erupted in Black Lives Matter protest, at the last minute, we had our editor switch out some of the images in the contemporary story with Brittany Packnett in order to make it feel, you know, like here we are in 2020, still dealing with the exact same issues that Mary Church Terrell was fighting for. Well, I hope we struck a good balance. Did it feel like you were hit over the head with, with social justice?
An amazing balance. And so I was just wondering, how did you, you know, decide, let's bring this in and give people that hope and empowerment that there are still people who are fighting this good fight today?
Well, I want to jump in to say the thing that's amazing about so many of these women's stories, especially because we use direct quotes from some of their diaries, some of their own letters, some of their own writings, is the things that they say could actually, you could just take it right off the page and say, well, this is a 2020 reality. I mean, before Kimberly Crenshaw talked about the urgency of intersectionality, Mary Church Terrell was saying that colored women are the only group in this country who have two heavy handicaps, that of race as well as gender. And so these women, the thing that I think makes their stories so poignant today is that they don't actually feel dated. And we specifically selected women who we saw as their modern day counterparts, who were operating in the same field, who were doing the same work, so that in mostly all the instances, it felt like there was really a seamless relay, if you will, that the ancestor woman kind of was in the fight at a certain point and has handed it off to someone who's operating in the contemporary space, who really kind of brings it up to date. And so rather than kind of beating you over the head with a social justice message, we feel like it's really more like an update.
I felt that way as well, and especially if it's used for educational purposes, I know that it'll help young students relate and seeing, you know, her friend killed, and this is what sparked a movement that changed so much in history and has impacted what's going on today.
And I think that actually it puts today in an even better context, because then you understand that there's really there's a long trajectory to these actions, that that this is part of a historical trend, and we are seeing progress. And sometimes the progress is measured exactly by looking at what happened before and seeing where some progress has been made now.
Absolutely. And that brings us to our second clip, which is super timely right now. Can you introduce the clip that we're going to see next?
So I'm really happy to be able to talk about, well, Mary Church Terrell is a shero of mine because she was born in Memphis, but most of her work was done in DC, which is my, so I see her as a home girl since I live in DC. But this is a woman that we're about to see her story that I really admire so much, because this woman really translated the power of journalism into community action, which in some ways Black newspapers and journalism has been doing over time for African-American communities. So she was she ran one of the largest newspapers in California for 40 years. And most people are just getting introduced to her now because, as the Democratic Party has just selected an African-American woman to be a vice presidential candidate considered the first woman of color to run for vice president for a major party, there's a woman who precedes her and who was on a ticket of a third party as a vice presidential candidate, but we don't even know her. Her name is really erased from the pages of history. So we are very, very happy to really introduce everyone to Charlotta Spears Bass.
For the first time in the history of our nation, a political party has nominated a Negro woman for the second highest office in the land.
Charlotta Bass was so far ahead of her time running for vice presidency of this nation. And she used her newspaper to fight for rights across the spectrum.
They say I don't act right. It's unladylike how I wanna live my life.
1912, Los Angeles, California. 24-year-old Charlotta Bass worked at the California Eagle, one of the first African-American newspapers in the state.
She found her way to that newspaper selling subscriptions. The California Eagle was founded by J.J. Nemore in 1879 to support the movement for equality among African Americans.
In 1912, Nemore called Bass to his deathbed.
It was Charlotta that he asked to carry the paper on after his passing, and she made a deathbed promise to him that she would.
Almost overnight, I became owner, editor, and publisher. Who had ever heard of a woman running a newspaper? It was the talk of the town.
Although there's some debate about the year and location, Bass was born Charlotta Amanda Spears in 1888 in Little Compton, Rhode Island. She attended desegregated public schools in Providence and worked selling ads and subscriptions for a black newspaper, the Providence Watchman.
In the white mainstream newspapers, African Americans were mentioned almost exclusively in stories about crime. That was it. So the black press provides coverage impossible to find in the mainstream press.
In 1906, Bass moved to Los Angeles, a city booming with the promise of jobs.
Negroes were in search of dignity and civil rights. It was the dawn of a new life in an atmosphere of freedom.
Everybody came to California, starting in the late 19th century. And African Americans were part of those migrations. On the one hand, that period was defined by violence against Black people, the rise of white mobs, lynching, and all kinds of terror. At the same time, this was actually a kind of golden age for African Americans. They were building institutions, publishing newspapers, developing a culture, and flourishing in many ways.
When Bass became one of the first African American women to own a newspaper in 1912, her first order of business was keeping the doors open.
It was an extraordinary thing for anyone to own a newspaper because of the kind of resources that it took to run the presses and to pay the bills and to just get the newspaper distributed.
Bass hired a veteran reporter as her second in command.
Joseph Bass was an experienced newspaper man. He'd been an editor on an African-American newspaper in Kansas before he migrated to California. Charlotta kept the title of managing editor, and Joseph Bass took care of internal workings of the paper.
They married in 1914. Under their joint leadership, the California Eagle grew from a 4-page tabloid to a 20-page weekly with the largest circulation of any African-American paper on the West Coast.
Every issue that people were facing, whether it was in the schools, in the job market, in housing, not being served in a restaurant, all were reflected in the pages of the California Eagle.
The paper dedicated itself to the task of waging bloodless but fearless war against segregation and discrimination wherever they raised their ugly heads.
The role the Black press has always had to play is to take Black people from being invisible and to try to push the country through our reporting to be more democratic. My name is Nicole Hannah-Jones, and I'm a staff writer at the New York Times Magazine. I got my first letter to the editor published when I was in middle school. I read a column I thought was racist, and I wrote a letter to the newspaper complaining. And I never forgot how empowering that felt to actually see my name in print. So the only reason I ever wanted to be a journalist was to write about racial inequality. I've done that with housing segregation, with school segregation, and the 1619 Project, which I created to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the first Africans being sold into the United States. Every single story in the magazine starts with America today and shows how these things about American life that you think are unrelated to slavery actually are. It was an effort to show that virtually nothing has been left untouched by the legacy of slavery and the American story. We were founded not as a democracy, but as a slaveocracy. I earned the Pulitzer Prize for my opening essay, which is on how Black Americans are the perfecters of democracy.
Charlotta Bass took a lot of risks in the work that she did. Southern California was one of the main fields where the Klan was recruiting, and she called them out on a regular basis in the pages of the newspaper. And she suffered a campaign of harassment and threats.
One night in 1925, Bass was working alone when 8 hooded members of the Ku Klux Klan showed up at the paper's offices.
She pulled a pistol out of the drawer of her desk and pointed at them.
I had never handled a gun before and wasn't quite sure which end to point at the intruders, but they evidently thought I might know how to shoot, and all 8 beat a hasty retreat.
Her husband told her, "You're going to get me killed one day, Mrs. Bass." And she always told him, "Well, Mr. Bass, it will be in a good cause."
After Joseph Bass died in 1934, Charlotte Bass ran the newspaper by herself for another 2 decades and became more involved in electoral politics.
She joined committees, she marched on picket lines, she lectured, she ran for city council, she ran for county office.
In the 1930s and 40s, Bass helped win a series of victories for equal rights, including ending employment discrimination at various LA companies.
Black people, and particularly Black women, are still vastly underrepresented in mainstream newsrooms. And that is why I helped co-found the Ida B. Wells Society for Investigative Reporting to do away with that one excuse that we hear all the time, which is we'd love to hire more Black investigative reporters. We just can't find any who are qualified. We've trained hundreds of journalists in the skills of investigative reporting. If we are not presenting our own communities, then other people will shape the way that our stories get told, what doesn't get told, and how the larger world sees us.
After being a member of the Republican Party for 30 years, Bass was frustrated by its lack of progress on civil rights. In 1948, she became one of the founders of a left-wing third party dedicated to ending segregation and protesting President Truman's Cold War policies. Bass ran for Congress in 1950 on the Progressive Party ticket. She lost, but didn't stop there.
In 1952, she actually ran for the office of the Vice Presidency of the United States with Vincent Hallinan on the Progressive Party ticket. There wasn't a chance in hell that they were going to win, much less get a lot of votes. But she took every opportunity she could to have her voice heard and to bring the kind of social justice that she thought was needed.
It is with great pride that I come before the American people at this moment. For the first time in the history of our nation, a political party has nominated a Negro woman for the second highest office in the land.
Bass was labeled a radical. The federal government investigated her as a potential communist. The post office tried to revoke her postage permit for the California Eagle. She sold the paper in 1951, and it continued publication until 1964.
I am very confident that within my lifetime I will see first-class citizenship achieved for all my people, true democracy for all Americans.
She's really been erased from national memory.
In her 70s, Bass transformed the garage of her home into a community reading room and voter registration site. Living long enough to witness the legislative victories of the civil rights movement. Bass died in 1969. She was 81.
What most inspires me about Charlotta Bass is her fearlessness. She had such a sense of obligation, not just to her own people, but to justice. I think she certainly helped create a path for someone like myself to exist.
I believe in a world of good. The battle is not won nor the struggle past, but I know the future will be even better.
They say I don't act right, it's unladylike, how I wanna live my life.
I love it. We are back with more questions. You can continue to put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom, and we will get to that in just a moment. But Sandy, can you talk about the power of the press during this time for the Black community during the civil rights movement?
You're on mute, Sandy.
Yeah, you're on mute.
As was stated by our historian Susan Anderson, as well as by Nicole Hannah-Jones, the Black press played an extraordinary role historically, as the accomplishments of Black people did not show up in mainstream media. And in addition to which, I think over 40 years, Charlotta Spears Bass had a weekly column called The Sidewalk. And in that column, she basically identified and called out discrimination, injustice in housing and schools. She fought the Klan. The Klan was very active, as was stated in California and LA. And she got access to a letter that was written by the head of the California Klan. She published it in her newspaper. She got death threats as a result of it. She called out police brutality. And she endorsed other women who were running for office. And so I really like a quote that we did not include, but as she stated, "I will not retire, nor will I retreat, not 1 inch, so long as God gives me vision to see what is happening and strength to fight for the things I know are right." So even when she ran for office in 1952 as vice president, when she ran for office as to be a member of Congress, et cetera, she wasn't really doing that because she wanted to be in the limelight or that it was about her ego. She did those things because, as she said, she was a supporter for freedom and justice for people everywhere. And she was using every platform she had access to do that, regardless of whether it was her newspaper or electoral politics. And she worked within the Republican Party for 30 years and then switched to the Democratic Party and kept trying to find a political vehicle to really put racial justice first. And that's when she ended up being a founding member of the Progressive Party.
And that leads to my next question. You said she wasn't really seeking the limelight like that. Is that a part of the reason, or did you find while doing the research that a lot of these women were not seeking the limelight? They were focused on the business of the day, and maybe that's why we haven't heard about these stories. And does it say anything about today, how women need to speak up and be proud of their accomplishments and say what they've done? Charlotte, can you speak to that?
Sure. Well, I think it varied from woman to woman. Some of them were definitely self-promotional, but I think most were really focused on the work at hand and making sure that their voice was heard. Indeed.
And one quote that really resonates with me is from Michelle Obama, who says, "It's rare for a Black woman to tell her own story, and that it shouldn't be an uncommon thing, especially in modern times." Sandy, what do you think can be done or needs to be done to give more women the opportunity to share their stories and to tell their stories in these innovative ways?
I'm going to go back to the two women that whose lives we just got a snapshot of. Mary Church Terrell was an amazing organizer. She went around the country making speeches for the NAACP. She helped to organize Black women across the country. But one of the things she wanted to do that she was not able to do, that was her life stream, was to actually publish. She did publish her own biography, but it never really got the level of national attention, and she never got the kind of book deal that she wanted. Similarly, when we look at Charlotta Spears Bass, most of the reporting on her says she was born in South Carolina, but Charlotte went to Los Angeles and went and looked through boxes of Charlotta Spears Bass's own handwritten notes. And when she kind of laid out her biographical story, which she was also trying to organize to publish her own story. So I think that both of these women, as our predecessors, really did try to set the standard for being the tellers of our own story, not waiting for other people to tell our story, not assuming that someone is going to necessarily see the merit of the work, and also being able to put it through our own lens and our own analysis. So I think that there is a lot to learn from that. And obviously Michelle Obama, in writing Becoming, and also having a podcast, et cetera, has many forums around which she can give voice to her own ideas. And I think it is a very powerful model that, so thankfully things have changed since the time period of early in the 1900s when both of these women were making their mark in the world of politics. Obviously now we do have many, many forums for being able to self-publish, to get our stories told. So we're grateful for their example to show us how important it is to be your own storyteller, which is basically what Charlotte and I have definitely learned from telling all of these women's stories.
Do you think, or did any of the women maybe fly under the radar because what they were doing wasn't legal at the time, and it was so far ahead of their time that they could have been jailed or their life threatened as well?
We even came across newspaper articles from 1895 in New York City, women being arrested for wearing pants in public. So it gives you a sense of how restrictive life was. Obviously, women couldn't vote in most of the country. Some laws had just recently been passed that could allow you to get a divorce or to own custody of your children. But there were laws in place in some states where married women could not work. So quite a number of our women actually did not get married because they chose to pursue a career instead. Some of the ones who did had supportive husbands, and some had husbands who tried to stop their careers. One of our women, for instance, Meta Warwick Fuller, who was an African-American sculptor, had to build herself a secret studio unbeknownst to her husband because she planned to pursue her career making statues, and he thought that she should be home taking care of him and the children. I'm so sorry, I've forgotten your question because I went off on that tangent.
Oh, but, no, it's fine.
And I mean, even coming back to Charlotta Spears Bass, I mean, she was called a communist, and she was really surveilled by the FBI. I mean, there's another woman that we profile who was the first queen and last monarch of Hawaii, Queen Liliuokalani, and she took on the entire U.S. government. Nobody knows that story, to fight the takeover of Hawaii, which was a sovereign nation by the US, and to fight the annexation of Hawaii as a state. So these women were doing, when you think about it, it's just, as Charlotte just mentioned, the time period and the amazing limitations that were really placed on the movement, the expression, the function, and the liberties and equality of women, what these women did.
If I can just add one other thought, but some of them were famous in their lifetime. You know, there were in some cases global headlines about their accomplishments, like, you know, the first woman to climb the Matterhorn in pants became an international sensation. Or the
Wheaties box, and
yes, the first woman to swim the English Channel had a ticker tape parade for her when she came home to New York, and was the first woman to visit the White House and get, you know, commendations from the president as an athlete. So sometimes they were very famous during their lifetime, but they just somehow got forgotten, and it was hard to find the archival materials to bring their stories back to life as a result.
With such an impressive set of change makers, how did you manage to whittle everything, their life's work, down to this, you know, small amount of time, 10, 12 minutes, to tell their stories and to do it justice?
Well, we were actually even more ambitious. When we first started, we pitched this as this was going to be digital shorts that were 5 to 8 minutes. And then we realized that's not even possible. So they range in length from 9 to 12 minutes. And many of their stories are so nuanced and just so amazing that they really do merit full-length films. So it took a lot of discipline. And so Charlotte and I basically co-wrote the scripts, and she typically policed me, I would say, in terms of pulling back and no, we can't tell that, and you know, and I just have to say okay. But it was great being able to work together as a writing team to really kind of focus on both the elements of their stories that not were just important, but also had some contemporary relevance, and also you know, working with. We had an artistic director, as Charlotte mentioned, who was a painter who had not done film before. And she got very excited about helping to actually either paint the archive or create scenes for us when the archive didn't exist. And we worked with a stop motion graphics animator who animated those scenes. So it helped us to be able to fill in the gaps visually in the storytelling. And we were also trying to create a visual style, a visual vocabulary that was very contemporary in a new style, if you will, of historical documentary filmmaking.
And you worked with an incredible group of people from all kinds of diverse backgrounds as well. Why was it important to make sure that the staff kind of reflected the diversity of the stories that you were telling?
Absolutely. Well, it was very much a woman-led team, although we had 3 or 4 men working with us who were, deeply committed also to women's issues. And yes, we really went out of our way to select talented filmmakers and, and emerging people in the business who were of diverse backgrounds, because it just makes the story so much richer and nuanced when you have different points of view being brought to the table. And similarly, the Humanities Advisory Board that Sandy mentioned we put together also reflect the diversity of the women. So we have, a Native American expert and a Latina, African American history expert, and so on, to a Jewish American. We sort of checked all the boxes to make sure that we were being truthful and as culturally sensitive as possible to the experiences of those communities at the turn of the 20th century.
What did the project leave you with after learning about so many incredible stories and women of history who've done so many incredible things? How did that change or shape the way you look at what's going on in today's society? Sandy?
Well, there are a couple of times that I've actually quoted some of these women recently. One of the stories we tell is about Magdalena Walker, who is the first African-American woman to own and operate a bank in Richmond, Virginia. And we were, within the series, we were able to actually interview 2 descendants of some of our heroines. And so Magdalena Walker's great-great-granddaughter makes a statement where she says, if Magdalena Walker could fund a bank, could start a bank in 1913, we have no excuses.
1903. Actually.
I'm sorry, 1903. We have no excuses. And so I feel like their stories have, we have on many occasions in our editorial meetings and our team meetings have had to remind ourselves, look, we are talking about unladylike behavior. So we've got to own up to that. And again, we're talking about a redefinition of that. Unladylike doesn't mean necessarily, in quotes, being rude. What unladylike means is owning space and being fearless. And that's what these women have taught us, and I think have really inspired us. Living with their 26 stories, I mean, I really feel like they've haunted us to some degree, that I can almost hear their voices, and I feel like they've actually kind of encouraged us in a way to be fearless in the way that we were able to complete the series, to complete an educational curriculum on each woman. I mean, Charlotte and I, we delivered our last film, the 26th film last Wednesday, and we even look back at it ourselves and say, how did we even do it? And in the middle of a pandemic,
yeah.
With all the limitations that entailed relative to not being able to go in the studios, having to work remotely, having 2 members of our archival team actually, unfortunately, of course, they are still with us, thank goodness, but, contracted the virus. I mean, we've had to contend with so many kind of unpredictable factors, as have other filmmakers, and everyone has had to make an adjustment in their daily and professional lives. But it was definitely an unladylike undertaking to finish everything that we did.
Absolutely. Charlotte, did you want to add on to that, or what were your takeaways?
Oh, sorry, I was distracted reading the Q&A. There's so many great questions coming in. Yeah, we'll be answering them next, or should I be trying to?
That'll be up next.
Wonderful. Well, I mean, I feel the wind of these women at my back every single day, and especially if I'm having a hard day, I just think, okay, well, if she did what she did back then in the face of the odds she was facing, I can really do anything. I'm someone who grew up with very low self-esteem, and it has been really transformative to be constantly reminded that I don't need to apologize for the space I take up in the world, and they're a great reminder of that every day for me.
Well, thank you all for this fantastic discussion. I'm going to go ahead and turn things back over to Katie Briggs, who is going to lead the question and answer portion of this discussion. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Liz, All right, so I have quite a few questions from the Q&A that have come up over the last hour. I just want to start out by saying there's been a ton of love for the series, both in the Q&A and the chat, like just such a positive reaction from folks that have attended today. So well done to both of you and your colleagues on putting something really remarkable together. So I first have some questions about kind of the research a little bit, and then we'll kind of step to how we can leave this webinar feeling both, inspired by the women who got us to this point and how we can kind of be empowered to act in the future. So the first question I have is kind of a two-parter based on both the research and some recent news. So one of our participants says that they searched the UNLADYLIKE2020 website and noticed that all of the women are deceased. All the women that are covered in the series are deceased. So she was wondering how come more modern day sheroes or heroes are who are still alive and active, like Michelle Obama and Kamala Harris, were not included. And then I want to tag a second Kamala Harris question onto that one, which is just how do you think that the women that you did cover in the series would respond to Kamala Harris being chosen as the VP candidate?
If I can start, and then I'll let you answer part two, Sandy. So there is a project called Makers that actually started on PBS, but is now owned by Oath, which is the company that AOL and Yahoo created when they merged. And they focus on women alive today. They really start with what's called the second wave of feminism, starting in the 60s, 70s, through today. And so we felt like they already had taken that space, but this first wave of feminism of the suffrage movement and the turn of the 20th century was really untold stories. So that's why we chose to focus on that time period.
So I would have to imagine that considering the ambitions and the focus of work of the women that we are profiling and creating portraits of, I'm sure that they would be immensely pleased at the choice of Kamala Harris, especially given her heritage representing women of color. So I would see that as a very positive development that especially Charlotta Spears Bass, whose story we just saw, would be very proud of. And just so folks know, the Charlotta Spears Bass episode is our last film, and that will be made public on August 26th. Tomorrow on Wednesday, our films we're dropping every Wednesday. Tomorrow, the next to the last film that we're presenting is a woman, Zakala Shah, who is a Native American activist who also was the first American Indian to compose an opera called the Sundance Opera that is based on what had been an outlawed religious ritual outlawed by the federal government. So I'm sure that Charlotta Spears Bass would be cheering Kamala Harris on.
Great. Okay, so two more, kind of a two-parter about the research still. So first, what was the average age of the women that you researched when they kind of reached the peak of their success? And then the second question is, was your research impacted by female ghostwriters, misgendered identities in the military and male-dominated careers, pen names, et cetera, other tactics that women might have used to be more accepted in their society?
I want to jump in on that. We produced a 1-hour special for American Masters called The Changemakers, and we pitched a number of different angles for what that hour was going to focus on. And one of the themes that we actually looked at was this whole idea of how women at the turn of the century really struggled in some ways around this question of gender and having to subvert their true non-conforming gender identities. And so, people talk about this concept of Boston marriage, but for, I would say easily out of the 26, there were at least, I'll say 5 to 10 women who, there was a lot of speculation about their sexual identity, but because of the time period, that they were very secretive about it and subverted it. In one instance, a labor organizer, a very famous labor organizer who came up with the the motto, bread and roses, actually burned her letters, burned all of her correspondence. So there would be no record of her relative to her, her sexual identity. So there's one woman that we feature, Gladys Bentley, who was definitely very out, but because of pressure, because of the Pansy Scare and the McCarthy era, subverted her sexual identity, and then later in her career wrote a big article that was in Ebony magazine saying, "I am a woman again." So part of what we do focus on, to the extent that we can, to the extent that the documentation is there for it, the levels of pressure that many women who were not following the domestic norms of the time period that they faced in making other sorts of gender choices. I'm sorry, what was the other part of your question?
Yeah, the other question was what the like average age was as you were doing research where women kind of like reached their peak of success or influence.
It depended. Some, especially the athletes, peaked in their teens and 20s. Others didn't start their career until their 50s. For instance, the Latina botanist Inez Mejia went back to school in her 50s and became one of the most prolific plant collectors in the world. And others were active throughout their lives. So we haven't actually done the math to see if there is an average age. It really varied from individual to individual.
Great. Okay. And then just a couple more questions here that are a little more about how we can, continue this work into the future. The first one is just, what are the most important unladylike reforms that need to take place today, and what steps can we take to forge the path?
Oh, brilliant questions. Well, unfortunately, many of the issues that women were fighting for back then are still an issue. The pay gap. Women are, on average, are earning 20 to 40% in the case of women of color, less than men for the same jobs. I saw there's a question in the chat about monumentation. Less than 8% of statues depicting historical figures in the US are of women. And often the statues that are up, for instance, in Central Park, are of fictitious women like Alice in Wonderland or Mother Goose. So in fact, next week on August 26th, the first monument to depict real life women is going up in Central Park in New York, of Susan B. Anthony, Sojourner Truth, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton as a suffrage monument. Out of 410 national parks in the US, only 9 are dedicated to women's history. How women's history is taught in our history curriculums in school. Women make up only about 7% of Fortune 500 CEOs today, only 24% of the US Congress. So a lot of work remains to be done, I would say, in all fields of our national life.
I would add, relative to a question that came in about marketing these, our shorts to schools. We did partner, Charlotte mentioned this, we partnered with PBS Learning Media and WNET Kids and Education to create an educational curriculum for all of 26 women that we've created films for. So that material is available at PBS Learning Media, and it's available free of charge to parents, to teachers, to school systems. And we hope that people will really use that material. And we're really trying to also start a conversation with curriculum developers, with folks at the state level who create the core curriculum, and with social studies teachers to really look at why women, and especially women of color, are not included in the American history curriculum. As Charlotte said, the Smithsonian Institution did some research of all the curriculum K through 12, and they said there was like 770 heroic figures that are repeated, and of those, about 170 of them are women, and most of those women are repeated only once in passing. And they're categorized as others, along with so-called other minorities. So I think we're in a historic moment where we're really looking at the elevation of the indigenous voice. And so part of what we think should be part of that movement is really examining what we are teaching our children, because it has a lot to do with the attitudes that they hold, the possibilities that they see, and the way that they look at other people. So if this information is made broadly available to young people as part of what they're taught in school, I think that it can really help to reframe our impression of other people and have a more authentic understanding of the making of this country.
Absolutely. We are at time. I want to just thank you, Liz, Charlotte, and Sandy, so much for being part of this panel and part of our celebration. And thank you to the audience, both for joining us for this celebration and for all your wonderful and engaging questions. Be sure to visit our website, publicmediawomeninleadership.org, to find out about what's in store in 2020 for our advanced webinar series, and to learn more about our Empowering Public Media initiative. And as always, we'll be posting the recording of this webinar to our website. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Katie. And thank you, Veronica. This was a fabulous afternoon and a great way to celebrate an important historic milestone.
I agree. And I just want to mention, if we didn't get to answer your questions, feel free to contact us through our website, and we'd be happy to be in direct contact with you.
Fabulous. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.